My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and if you ever got really deep into Tolkien, one of the things that you almost certainly read is the Silmarillion, and with the Silmarillion you got a pretty detailed view of the cosmology of Middle-earth and everything around it. The problem is, everything you think you know is wrong. Probably. Maybe? Not really sure. Point is, Tolkien did a lot of revising about the cosmology of Middle-earth and Arda and all of that in his later years, which he never finished. This was part of his kind of last attempt, his last kind of extended long attempt to get the Silmarillion ready for publication, because after the success of The Lord of the Rings, Alan and Unwin were actually kind of asking him for it, whereas before they had been like, we don't think we want that. That's a little much. But when The Lord of the Rings succeeded as well as it did, people were actually looking for all the background material that gets referenced, like the story of Barad and Luthien and all this other stuff. And so Alan and Unwin actually were like, okay, hey, if you could get that ready for publication, we'll take it now. So Tolkien began this long project, which he never completed, of trying to get the Silmarillion in a publishable form. As part of that project, he rethought, or at least considered rethinking, a lot of the stuff that was, long-standing basics in the mythology that he had created. And some of that had to do with the cosmology. And it's really interesting to look at because the reasons he had for changing things and whether he changed them at all are detailed pretty well in Christopher Tolkien's History of Middle-earth series and also partly in The Nature of Middle-earth. And there's a lot of stuff going on in his mind at the time. Part of what's going on there is his own desire kind of to keep not only consistent with everything he'd already written, but also this idea that had kind of arisen with The Lord of the Rings in particular of making it all kind of compatible with his Catholic theology, because he had gotten to a point where, as he puts in, I believe it's the foreword, I forget, but the famous line, of course, is, The Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously in the beginning, consciously in the revision. So, by the time he finishes The Lord of the Rings, he is kind of trying to keep everything very consistent with his own Catholic worldview, and he's also trying to make it more consistent with just a general, actual historical view of the world, because he is trying to make Middle-earth our Earth. And to do that, he has to make the history and the cosmology compatible with what he saw the actual history and cosmology of our world to be. Now, the problem arises, of course, our cosmology does not begin with let's say, a flat world with two giant light-producing trees that eventually die and then produce fruit which become the sun and the moon. That's not exactly how that turned out in actual Earth history. And so he was considering making some pretty substantial changes to how that cosmology worked. Now, Christopher Tolkien, of course, in his series on the history of Middle-earth, lays out all these different progressions and changes and whatever that Tolkien was going through in detail, not only in terms of the kinds of changes, but also the timeline. I'm not as interested in the timeline here because my point really is not to show what were Tolkien's final thoughts or what should we take to be the canonical version of Middle-earth cosmology. My point is to look at this in terms of why was he considering making these changes at all, and what ramifications that might have had for the story in a broader sense. Because Tolkien had this really interesting idea of trying to make everything jive with real-world history, but Christopher Tolkien notes in at least one place where he's discussing the potential changes to the cosmology and how it was going to be a world where the sun and moon were there the whole time, and I'll get to that in a little more detail later. And he said, in the interest of trying to make Middle-earth compatible with our world in terms of history and all this other stuff, he kind of lost maybe some of the beauty of the mythology. And I tend to agree, because the whole Silmarillion cosmology is interesting precisely because it's so different and unique. And this really plays into a lot of things that Tolkien thought and talked about over his long career. And not just his career as a, part-time amateur fantasy author, but also his career as an academic, because he published things academically that actually have some bearing on some of this. And that's why I want to talk about it, because we can see different aspects of what Tolkien wanted in fantasy and what he wanted for his own work and his own just personal preferences starting to come into conflict. And it's not just, him changing his mind over time thinking, oh, this tweak would make it a little bit better. It's actually, he's got like 3 or 4 different major sections in his mind. One of them is language. One of them is his Catholic theology. One of them is his thoughts on myth in general, and all these different areas. And he starts with all these different ideas of what they are, but when they all start to converge, it turns out there might be a few contradictions, and he has to wrestle with how to make all that work. So what I'm going to look at is some of the ways that he was thinking about changing that cosmology, how it really plays with some of the ideas that he talks about in other areas, and maybe give my own opinion on whether he landed in the right spot, or whether Christopher Tolkien landed in the right spot, I suppose. So, of course, the basic Silmarillion cosmology of the 2 trees of Valinor, which eventually get, poisoned by Ungoliant, and then their last 2 surviving fruits being made into the sun and moon, goes back pretty much to the beginning of when he really started working on what we can call the Silmarillion generally. It's not his earliest writing in that overall mythology, but it's as soon as he starts thinking about the origins of his own mythological world, he pretty much comes there instantly. And what Tolkien says in one place is that he wanted this mythology to be something that he could dedicate to England. It was a way of kind of replacing the native English mythologies that had been lost due to the Norman conquest and other things in British history that had wiped out a lot of what were basically the native versions of their own cultural mythologies and histories. So he starts out with this project of, this is a mythology. Well, it's not necessarily his starting point, but it's an early idea that he comes up with of, now that I'm writing this mythology, I'm going to make it into, this is kind of the old British mythology. And this was a thing Tolkien did a lot, especially with languages. He would invent, and I use that term kind of loosely, but he would invent words, say in Gothic, and this is a thing that, is documented, to basically place hold for words that were just not known. There's a lot of the Gothic language that isn't recorded anywhere, and so what Tolkien would do is he would be like, I think it's probably this, based on everything else we do know, and I'm just going to make believe that's true. And make believe, again, I'm using as kind of a loose word, but the point is, it's like nobody could document it, and nobody could prove him wrong either, so it's like his guess is as good as anybody else's. So he does this kind of thing a lot. He reaches back into history where there are gaps, and he says, how can I fill that gap? Whether it's language, whether it's native British mythologies, whatever. And so this is kind of what he does. He takes his mythology and he says, okay, well, I'm just going to say that this is what the British mythology was. And this is what leads down that road ultimately to the contradictions, because once you start down the path of this is the British mythology, you then have to come up with this, you have to make it, work in the sense of it's part of the world. Tolkien's ideas develop over time in such a way that he ends up having an English mariner named Alfwine who ends up going to the Lonely Isle and learning a lot of what they know, and this is where the Silmarillion information comes from. And then the Lonely Isle itself becomes Britain. There's a lot of stuff going on here, which is interesting in a lot of ways, but it he more and more over time makes it not merely mythology, but more history. And this is how we get to that point ultimately of the contradictions, because he starts it out as this is English mythology. Now it's a mythology which claims to be history, and ultimately he ends up kind of making it history. And over time, things just get more and more intertwined. And the same starts with The Hobbit. He starts The Hobbit as just a children's story for his own kids. But then when he starts writing the sequel, which becomes The Lord of the Rings, it ends up becoming more and more a part of his own mythology, and it just gets more intertwined until he just gives up and he's like, okay, it's all Middle-earth. And then he revises The Hobbit to kind of fit that some more, and he, fits The Lord of the Rings in as much as he can. And then he has to go back and change some of his original Silmarillion ideas to fit what he's already written in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. So far, we don't really have a problem, but we end up with more and more issues that come up as time goes on. As he, goes about doing what he does, he actually ends up having a conversation with, and I think it's in letters, but he ends up having a conversation basically with a Catholic priest, I believe it was, who criticized some of his storytelling elements as being not really compatible with Catholicism, and Tolkien defends himself. And in so doing, we can see that he is trying to keep all of this stuff kind of consistent with his own more background kind of, and more important, really, thoughts about just the world in general. Ultimately, the most important thing to Tolkien was his faith. He was very, very devout as a Catholic for pretty much his entire life. And so consistency with his own faith was important to him. But now we've brought in another thread. Now we have not only mythology, we have kind of pseudo-history at least, maybe even real history, and now we've got theology coming into the mix. So you can see how we're kind of headed for a problem eventually if all these things keep going down the road. If The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion are in fact history, and they have to be compatible with real-world history, which Tolkien views through the lens of Catholicism because he sees Catholicism as being true, and therefore real-world history includes the fact that the world was created by God and that his son entered the world as Jesus at some point in time. Now we have a lot of things going into this soup that is, some of those flavors may not meld well together. And we can see the same thing going on when he writes, for example, the Athrabeth with Finrod and Andreth, because there he is having Finrod and Andreth talk about things, and Finrod eventually comes up with this idea that God has to somehow enter the world in order to fix it, which is Tolkien basically playing with speculative theology, predicting the the incarnation of God. So there's this whole thing going on where he's more and more bringing all these elements together that don't have to go together, but because they're all important to him, they all end up getting into the mix. Now, Tolkien does have second thoughts about the Athrabeth because he thinks it's a little bit too on the nose. Nevertheless, it's an important piece of writing, and it shows us where his mind was. So all of these things are starting to come together by the time he finishes The Lord of the Rings, and then as he's redoing the Silmarillion, he actually starts looking at, okay, well, how do I make all this fit together now that I've kind of committed in some ways to Lord of the Rings is in some sense a real part of our history. Numenor is Atlantis that really was out there and really sank, and all these other things. There just ends up being so many things he has to think about. And he's like, well, it can't actually be that the world started with a couple of trees that produced light, which then gave fruit, which became the sun and the moon. And because that can't be true, it also can't be true that the elves believed that, because the elves, from whom we get all these stories, ultimately, because obviously men and dwarves and whatever weren't around to even have any inkling of what that is, the elves would have been instructed by the Valar, who obviously knew the truth. And so we can't assume that the Valar lied to the elves, and that the elves just couldn't understand something fairly basic like there's a sun out here and we're revolving around it and then the moon is revolving around us. That's not hard, right? So he's like, okay, well, I've got to find a way to fix this because now it's a problem. Because if I'm going to fit this into the history and make it mesh with the theology and everything else, with, Eru being effectively the Christian god and the Valar being some kind of angelic beings who must be good based on, his own theology, we can't actually make all this jive. So he comes up with a bunch of different ways to try to fix this problem that he's created for himself. Now, to kind of spoil the ending in a sense, he eventually comes up with an idea, and again, I'm not really getting the timeline here, so this is not necessarily his last thoughts on the subject, but he comes up with the idea of, well, what if the Silmarillion stuff is really like a Númenórean or later Mannish take on what was passed down from elves longer ago and which has therefore been kind of corrupted over time, and then we can still kind of keep the myth but not have it actually be true because that would kind of let him keep everything all at the same time. You would still get the really beautiful ideas of the two trees and all this other stuff that he really wanted to keep and which had been in the mythology for so long, but also allow him to square it with actually real historical, world events and whatnot. But along the way, he tries a bunch of other things. So at one point, he has this theory that, the stars and the sun and the moon are already out there from the beginning, but in Valinor, they have kind of this dome thing which allows either allows starlight through or which has pseudo stars in it, so it gives you kind of that ancient historical idea of, the sky is just a dome and there's little sticks of light in it, that you can actually see at nighttime. So that's one idea that he has. This keeps out the sun and the moon so that we can kind of make it work. We still don't have the sun and the moon, and we still do have the trees, but it's, they're not the same thing, and they're coexisting at the same time. We just don't see the sun and the moon because of this dome that's over Valinor. So this is one of the ideas that he has, and there's others that he toys with as well. He toys with at one point just scrapping the whole thing and rewriting it with the sun and the moon present from the beginning, and there's just... But again, he wrestles with that because everything about the mythology is so rooted in language. The elves are Eldar, and they're called Eldar because they are star people. They awoke under the stars, and he toys with this idea of, well, when they first woke up, it was just starlight. But it just happened to be nighttime. And as Christopher notes, if I remember correctly, he's like, but this seems kind of weak. This doesn't really seem like a very good poetic way of giving them the name star people just because they happen to wake up at night with no moon. I mean, is that really satisfactory? So he toys with all these different ideas, trying to come up with a way to keep everything he really wants. And it's not that easy because he comes up with all these different ideas, and it's like there's always one thing that's just kind of a nagging problem. So, in this particular instance, it's like waking them up in the middle of the night with just happens to be no moon. It works on a technical level, but it's not satisfactory in terms of why you call them star people. The dome idea doesn't, really satisfy either, because then you have to come up with all these ad hoc things to make all the stuff that he really wanted to hang on to still work in this new mythology. And so, Christopher's idea, was basically, he could have just kept the mythology, and, it's a mythology. That's what it is. It's not supposed to be necessarily 100% accurate. But Tolkien, at this stage in his life, was really, really, really trying to make everything jive. His theology, the mythology, the cosmology, and make it all at least logically consistent with it being part of our real world. Now, was that maybe a little bit too much to ask of himself? Probably. But Tolkien, as always, was very keen to start ambitious new projects and not necessarily finish them. And we can see why he didn't necessarily finish in this particular case, because this is probably from roughly the same period that we get the nature of Middle Earth material on how do elves age and how long do they live and what is their life cycle actually like. And he goes through multiple iterations because he's trying to make everything work down to the last detail so that the suspension of disbelief and the ability to just be part of the world without any hangups is perfect. That seems to be what Tolkien was going for. And he seems to have had the idea that, well, if we have the sun and moon be the products of the two trees and all this other stuff, then that immediately ruins the suspension of disbelief because we all know that's not true. And but again, I kind of take Christopher's side on this, where it's like, just let the story be a good story. It doesn't have to be that perfect. But what's interesting is how all this starts to really take shape in terms of things that he had said and thought about for a long time. So, for example, one of the interesting intersections I find in all of this is the kind of stuff that he talks about in On Fairy Stories. And if you have not read that essay slash paper that he delivered, you really need to, because there's a lot of stuff in there that plays into so much of his myth making. It's ridiculous. But in particular, one of the things that he says is that one of the benefits or values of fantasy is the idea of recovery. And it's this idea that we recover our sense of awe and wonder at the world around us, because as we go through life and we see the same things over and over and over again, we start to just kind of ignore them as being humdrum and day-to-day stuff. And the example he gives is, well, but what if your story has a green sun? Now you can look at the world with a green sun in this fantasy story, and then when you look at your own sun, hopefully not directly with your naked eyes, but when you see your own sun that's yellow again, you have a renewed sense of, wow, it didn't have to be like that. That's really cool. And so there's this idea that myth and fantasy, by giving us things that are outside our normal experience, can rejuvenate our ability to appreciate the things that are in our everyday experience. But now the question arises, if the point of fantasy is to give us this sense of recovery, what is the point of making his own fantasy so real that we lose all of that, right? Now we have this problem of, well, the idea of the two trees was always, these are kind of like the original true magical sun and moon, and what we have now is only pale imitations, which makes you look at them in a different way. But now, if the sun and the moon were always there, and they were either just hidden, or just they happened to wake up at night with no moon, or suddenly it kind of loses all that sense of awe and wonder that it would have created. So his idea about what fantasy does, the point of fantasy, he's kind of backtracking on by doing these kinds of revisions in his stories. And it's really interesting to think about that, because as with many things that Tolkien did in his lifetime, he was constantly tinkering with his own ideas. And I'm not certainly trying to criticize him for developing ideas and all this other stuff, but it's really fascinating to think about, if he had to go back and maybe read his own essay at that point in his life and really think about, what is my project here? What am I really trying to do? Am I trying to write fantasy? Am I trying to... What is it? What's the point? Would he have changed his mind about what he wrote in On Fairy Stories? Or would he have realized, maybe the real idea here is I just don't need to make these changes because it is ultimately fantasy and mythology? Of course, we have no way of answering that question, and so, we can puzzle about it all we like, but it's just interesting to really think about how Tolkien had all these different ideas, that he sometimes didn't always follow consistently and tried to mash them together and turn them into something of a coherent whole in ways that didn't always come out very clean. And so it becomes really easy to see why Tolkien never finished the Silmarillion. I mean, early in his life, he didn't always have as much time as he wanted, and he was constantly trying to expand it and do different things with it. Later in his life, when he finally has more time, it becomes a really interesting puzzle to solve, and suddenly he's got time, but he's created a lot of issues for himself, and now it's not so easy. He can't just go back and, tweak things and perfect what he doesn't like quite so much. He has to actually figure out, like, what am I doing, and how do I take all these different ideas and make them all compatible with each other. This is why I find this so fascinating, because he starts this project of upending so much of his mythology and doing it for reasons that, on the one hand, are not, ignoble or, unworthy of consideration. I mean, it makes sense why, given everything he had already done up to that point, he would want to go back and try to make everything kind of fit, and fit not only with the rest of what he had written and published, but with his own theology and everything that goes along with it, because he had kind of started himself down that road a long time ago and just hadn't necessarily foreseen all the consequences. But there's this, just because you create the road doesn't mean you necessarily have to keep it going straight the whole time. Sometimes the most interesting roads are the ones that curve just at the most strange spot for no apparent reason, but that creates, something a little more interesting. And, this is one of the reasons why, if you're driving for a long time, straight roads are some of the most boring, and dangerous, frankly, to drive on. Because the more you drive on just a straight road and the more bored you get, the less attention you pay. Similarly, if Tolkien had just chosen, all right, we're going to stick on this straight road and just go down the line, would his story have been as interesting? Or do we want and even need, in these kinds of stories, strange turnings and twists and things that, don't necessarily make sense if you really go down to the fundamental level, but which do make sense in the broader scheme of things of, was this an interesting, fun trip or not? Did we enjoy the ride? Because ultimately that is what it's about. It's about enjoying the ride. No story is ever going to be 100% perfect in that way. Humans are just not capable of creating absolute perfection. It's just not going to happen. But we are pretty good at taking flaws and making them into something beneficial. And in fact, most of us, and I can speak to this from my own personal relationships, most of the time what we find interesting in other people is something that is a slight flaw, but which adds spice to their character. It's just natural that we're going to see things like just asymmetry in some sense and go, well, that kind of makes you unique and therefore more interesting. So it's really interesting to think about how Tolkien might have come out. But the more important thing is, did we really like what we got in the end? And I think, really, we did. Most of us who have read the Silmarillion and actually got through it, a lot of people have not. And that's, everybody has their own issues with the Silmarillion. But for most of us who have managed to read the whole thing, we do appreciate the fact that there are these strange things that you can't necessarily make completely compatible with everything that we might want to make it compatible with. Precisely because what we are looking for is something that is strange and different and other. And that, I think, Tolkien probably would have ended up realizing that some of that is still of value. And maybe he wouldn't have ended up making huge changes to his mythology if he'd had another 100 years. Maybe he would have. But I think certainly the story is served by Tolkien not having done that. And so, in that sense, I don't know exactly how much of the material Christopher had at his hands when he actually did the final editing. But if he knew of these attempts by J.R.R. Tolkien to change up the mythology and make it compatible with real cosmology, I think at least he made the better choice in the end of saying, it's actually better if we just stick with the interesting story and leave aside maybe some of the considerations of accuracy in that kind of pedantic sense. So in that sense, I think we got pretty much what we wanted and what most of us would rather have in the end. But it is a really interesting thing to think about all that Tolkien went through trying to figure out how to make it all jive. So if you enjoyed this interesting trip through Tolkien's considerations of cosmology, theology, and mythology, do give the video a thumbs up, share it around. If you want to catch my future content, make sure you subscribe. And if you're on YouTube, make sure you click the bell icon so you don't miss any notifications. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter to catch Tolkien-related trivia questions every week. And check out other social and support links in the description below. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore Channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Nathan Dufour and Robert Kendling.